class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 11 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Tampa Bay Lightning, in which the Sharks have lost 4-3. A pretty heartbreaking loss for the San Jose Sharks. It looked like that this game was going to be heading to overtime. It was tied at 3, less than a minute to go. We could potentially get to that overtime period where the Sharks have done well thus far this season, 2-0 at this point. We could have seen another Erik Karlsson show-stopping move, which if he had scored then would have been a hat-trick goal, 3 goals on the game, 7 goals on the year, would have been crazy. But instead the Sharks shoot themselves in their own foot and give the Lightning the opportunity to take the lead in that last minute, and they do exactly that. And as such, the Sharks will once again let this game slip away, lose it, get no points in the standings, and lose it 4-3. Having said all that, I remember it was just a few reviews ago during the Sharks' 5-game losing streak where I mentioned that I'm not too disappointed in the Sharks losing games. I was mostly disappointed in the fact that the Sharks were losing games that weren't even close, weren't even very exciting, like those ones against the Islanders and against the Blackhawks. Here tonight, this game was incredibly exciting. The Sharks showed a lot of fight in them. The Lightning had multiple leads in this game, 1-0, 2-1, 3-2, and then of course 4-3, which would be the final score. But the Sharks each time besides the last one, where there was just not enough time, managed to make the comeback. And so this game actually ended up being not only rather interesting, but the Sharks played pretty well. So all in all, even if it is a loss, I thought it was a pretty decently fun game to watch. But of course, you would have maybe wanted to see the Sharks be able to really cap it off there, at least go to overtime for some interesting 3-on-3 play. But a heartbreaking maneuver there in that last moment, which I'll get to a bit later, kind of cost the Sharks this game. In the first period, it starts off immediately with a Victor Hedman goal to give the Lightning a 1-0 lead, but past that point, the Sharks kind of took over the first half of the first period. They would get the game-tying goal at just about a minute later from Erik Karlsson, the dueling number one defenseman here on both of these teams. And like I said, through the first half of the first period, the Sharks actually looked very good, but the latter half of it got away from them. They couldn't really get any more good offensive zone time like they were doing in the prior half, and the Lightning would get another goal for themselves to take the lead 2-1 going into the second period. In the second period, the Sharks would once again start off rather well. The first half of the second period was quite solid for the Sharks. They got the game-tying goal once again from Nico Sturm, but then in the latter half of the second period, they fell off once more. The Lightning came back, got another goal for themselves quite late in the second period with about a minute and a half to go from Killorn, and so the Lightning would once again hold a lead going into this third period. But the Sharks, like I said, very resilient this game, would get a goal from Erik Karlsson on the power play, his second of the game, to tie this game up at 3. And like I mentioned earlier, it looked like this game was indeed destined to go to overtime. But then this final play here, a shift for the Timo Meier, Tomas Hertl and Evgeny Svechnikov line. Erik Karlsson also on the ice. He pinches in to try and make some sort of play happen. Svechnikov rightfully covers him up at the point, but then when a puck is loose in the middle of the offensive zone, Svechnikov cheats down from the point, leaving it completely uncovered, so that when the Lightning manage to retrieve the puck for themselves, it's a 2-on-1 the other way. Erik Karlsson does his best to try and get back into the play, and he manages to do so, but then Mario Ferraro doesn't necessarily have the coverage. There's not enough defensive back check from either Meier or Svechnikov, and it allows Kucherov, basically who just sits right in front of the net with zero man coverage in front of him, to tap in a goal past Reimer. No chance for James Reimer on that one. And the Lightning get the win 4-3. So a mistake from Evgeny Svechnikov, which brings me here to this first line where he continues to play with Tomas Hertl and Timo Meier. And this was definitely the San Jose Sharks' best line of the night. There is no argument about that. But a lot of that does have to do with the fact that they found themselves on the ice a lot with Erik Karlsson. And Karlsson serves the purpose of that sort of third forward in that situation, because Svechnikov doesn't really do that great of a job in that. His cycling is okay, but he doesn't have very good vision, so he's never going to be able to find like great open lanes. His shot is decent, but not amazing. There was this one opportunity where it was a pass from Megna to Svechnikov, who was left wide open for that one-timer, and he just completely fanned on it. That wasn't very good to see. But also on the other side of things, not just in the offensive zone, but in the defensive zone, when you're on that top top line, you're also expecting to face off against the top players of the other team, and Hurdle and Meyer are used to that, but Svechnikov absolutely isn't. There was this one particular shift where they faced off against Stamkos, Kucherov, and Braden Point, and we saw within just about 5 or 10 seconds, Stamkos completely walk around Svechnikov, and then when Svechnikov gets the puck, eventually, a few seconds later, he then just gets it completely stripped from him from Nikita Kucherov. So Svechnikov just not really good enough, and this isn't actually his fault in that particular situation to be on this first line. But what is definitely his fault is that ladder play. You're the man covering the point here for Erik Karlsson. You cannot afford to cheat down with just a minute left in the game in a tie game to try and get a loose puck like that. If the Sharks were down by a goal, sure, you make a play like that, but in a tie game, it's definitely not necessary. And I imagine if Svechnikov were like, some sort of rookie playing their first few games of the season, if he was like a William Eklund or Thomas Bordeleau at the moment, he'd probably just get sent down immediately for making such a heinous mistake. When it comes to Svechnikov, obviously he's not like some grizzled veteran, but he is slightly older, and as such, I imagine he'll manage to stay in the lineup, but we'll see if he actually manages to stay on the first line. Unfortunately for the Sharks, they don't actually have many better options at this point, especially if they want to keep Barabanov on the second line, because moving to that second line, Barabanov, Couture, and Nieto actually played pretty well. Not an outstanding game from these three players, as they're still trying to find some chemistry, and like I said with Svechnikov, Nieto doesn't necessarily belong on a second line, but I've been very impressed with Barabanov's play in these past couple of games. Really is looking significantly better than he did earlier on in the season, where he wasn't necessarily finding much of a footing when playing on that first line, and it also has brought up somewhat Logan Couture, who was also struggling when he was constantly with a different set of line mates pretty much every game, and not the most competent of line mates at that. And like I said, when it comes to Matt Nieto, not fitting in super well on the second line, but if I had to choose one of either keeping Nieto on the second or keeping Svechnikov on the first, I'd probably keep Nieto on the second because he looks less out of place than Svechnikov. When it comes to the third line, they did, of course, get a goal here, even if it wasn't necessarily the prettiest of goals, one that Vasilevsky, the Lightning goaltender, would absolutely want back, but it still was Sturm's 5th of the season, which is incredibly impressive through 11 games for a player who the Sharks expected to be not much more than a fourth line, potentially flexing to a third line center position. He ends up on a line here with Cunnin, not the same thing from last game, but he also ends up with Bonino, who finally returns to the lineup after a few games out with injury. And did Bonino come back here with sort of a new sense of energy and purpose? Not really. Bonino was still pretty bad here tonight. Definitely the worst player on his line, I would say. Sturm looked pretty decent. Cunnin actually had a couple of strong offensive opportunities, but to say the least, this line did kind of get hemmed into their zone a decent amount. So not an amazing game from the third line, but at the very least, they had a couple chances. They did score a goal, so it wasn't too bad either. And then we get to the fourth line, Lindblom, Lorentz, and LeBanc, the L line, which is probably not a great nickname to have as a line, but I'm going to use it anyway. But they were not an L here this game. I thought they actually played pretty decently. Lindblom had like a pretty decent chance. Lorentz had a couple of issues this game, but not too bad. LeBanc was there as well. It wasn't super impactful, but they didn't give a ton either to the Lightning while they were on the ice. So for a fourth line, even though it's featuring players like LeBanc and Lindblom, who 3-4 weeks ago you would have thought may have been being larger factors in the Sharks' top 9, they do find themselves now on the fourth line. They did a decent job, but it's still somewhat disappointing to see these two names here. On to the defensive side of things. Once again, we do, of course, have to talk about the sort of elephant in the room, which is Erik Karlsson. Adds another 2 goals here, now officially a point-per-game player. At the end of last game against the Leafs, because of his massive performance there, he had 9 points in 10 games. Now with another 2 points, he's got 11 in 11, including 6 goals, his best goal-scoring start to a season of his entire career, which is not necessarily something that I thought I'd be saying just a few weeks ago, but he really has just gotten better as the season has gone on. Really started like down here in game 1, and he's suddenly all the way up here. Is he playing like an $11.5 million defenseman? It's a bit difficult to say, because of course there are if you're getting paid $11.5 million as a defenseman, you want to be like one of the best, if not the best offensively, and then also the same thing on the defensive side of things. Karlsson is not one of the best on the defensive side of things, but at the moment he is asserting himself as one of, if not the best currently in the league, just based off of current performance. Obviously, I'm not trying to say he's like better than Cale Makar or anything like that, but just based off of current point scoring performance offensively, Erik Karlsson definitely right up there. So on the offensive side of things, he's definitely giving his worth here of his contract, trying to do as much as possible to try and get the Sharks these wins, even though they only have 3 out of these 11 games. I believe the stat is that Karlsson, for the 24 goals that the Sharks have scored this season, Karlsson has been on the ice for 17 of them, which is an absolute ton, but it's also not that much of a surprise when Karlsson is not making moves in the offensive zone and the Sharks are left with like Benning and Vlasic or Ferraro and Shemek. There is some movement from the point. You do see the effort being there, but it's nowhere near the type of performance that Erik Karlsson is able to do. And the problem is that when you have kind of weaker forwards up front as well, and you're also having weaker offensive defensemen in the back, not a ton can happen. So even though we did see a lot of decent offensive zone shifts from the third and fourth line in particular earlier on in this game, not much actually amounted from those shifts because there's just not a lot of great offensive talent there. And then finally, to talk about the Sharks goaltender here, James Reimer, it was a decent game for Reimer, though not amazing. Like I mentioned earlier, he didn't have any chance on the Kucherov goal, but the Killorn one he probably could have had, even though this was on a 2-on-1 type of situation. The Hedman one he technically also could have had. So 4 goals on the amount of shots that he faced was not super impressive, especially when you consider the fact that Reimer has previously been super strong thus far this season. So maybe one that he would have liked a bit of a do-over on. But that will do it for this review. The San Jose Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, and while they are back into the losing column, they definitely have been playing a lot better over these past few games, and hopefully that can continue moving forward. Even if the Sharks are losing games, it has been much more exciting to watch as of late. Class dismissed.